The pastors of three of our major EME churches in Charleston, Reverend Butler, Reverend Finkley, and Reverend Grady. They were pastors of three of our major EME churches. And they wanted to enter into a program of non-church, but to create a living conditions for not only members of their church, but for black residents in Charleston County with respect to their living conditions and home conditions. And they wanted to purchase some property and see what they could do to develop a project here in Charleston to provide low-cost housing, but with modern conditions for just average black families, not only in their local churches, but for black families throughout this area. The kind of accommodations that they could afford, but with modern facilities and so forth. That kind of facility was not available for black families at that time. We had some federal projects, governmental operations for black families in Charleston, in the Charleston area, but they wanted to provide something a step above that. And they wanted to form an organization whereby they could apply to the federal government for funds to build a project. The government had established a project, low-income for low-income families at that time, and there was not any on that level in Charleston. And these ministers of these three EME churches wanted to see if they could formulate an organization which would seek the kind of funding to provide that kind of a project and living conditions for black families. And we talked about it, and I investigated it, and we first had to we talked with our congressman, and we talked with members of our local delegation here, and then we had to find a suitable piece of property. And we met with members of the Charleston County delegation, and they were very agreeable to the idea of assisting us in that project. And these three pastors did the groundwork to formulate. First, they had to find the property, and then they had to develop the organization structurally that suited the federal government. And my job was to formulate a corporation which would could seek and acquire the approval of the federal government to finance the project, because they had no money at all. And we found a piece of property here on James Island, and that was the first thing we needed to do. And then we acquired a contract to purchase that property, and then we sought out a contractor, EME DeCosta Company, and we got him to develop some plans, and we submitted that to the appropriate federal government, part of the federal government which was handling that at that time. And we got the approval to develop this particular project on James Island. Herbert DeCosta Contracting Company was a company that had an excellent reputation, and they went ahead and developed the plans, and Mr. J. Arthur Brown, who owned this, where we are today, this particular tract of land, agreed to enter into a contract with us with $100 down with the contract, subject to our being able to get the approval of the federal government to provide the funds to purchase this land and also to build the project. We first had to organize these churches into a structure which was approved by the federal government. And it was my job at that time. I was just a young attorney, and that was one of my first major projects. And I organized a corporation called the EME Apartments, and acquired a charter from the Secretary of State, and we became incorporated. And then we applied for a loan to build this particular project, and we were approved. And the EME DeCosta Company came in and built this particular project in 1968. We were chartered in April of 1968, and we acquired this property a short time after that in 1968, and built this property in 1968. And it was the first project of that kind in South Carolina, because it was a step above what these various cities and counties were building for low-income projects. This was a little higher than the average low-income project which was being built by your various cities and counties at that time. And this was high class, and we got the approval for it, and we got approval to build it, and then we had the problem of finding somebody to manage it, and we finally got the right people to manage it, and we've been successful with it from that time. I'm going back now. This was 1968. And so you see how long ago that was. And less than a year from the meeting that we had in my office, from the fruition of getting the approval to build the project. First, we had to acquire the land, and then we had to get a contractor that was approved by the government.
Well, shortly after President Kennedy was assassinated and President Johnson became the president, he instituted a program called the Great Society. And in this concept, he being mindful of the United States Constitution that demands separation of church and state, he wanted to implement an affordable housing system for indigents or low-income people, which basically for black people, but he had to wrap it in the appropriate perspective. And so he thought about, well, the black church build a program and give grants to black churches, and that way you could get to the indigents, and through their churches, it would be a great step towards this great society that he will implement. And so that's how the churches became eligible to receive federal funds because of his overall program of the Great Society. And so the first church in South Carolina that I knew of to take advantage of this Great Society concept and idea was in Sumter, Mount Pisgah Church in Sumter. Fred James, Reverend James, was the pastor, and he had applied, and Judge Finney, who was a local lawyer there at the time, Judge Finney handled a project for him to do one of these projects around the Sumter area. Fred James, who was now Bishop James, he was the pastor of Mount Pisgah at that time. And they had just done one of these programs. And so Judge Fields and I went up, you remember we went up to Sumter? Yeah. To Fred James and Finney and got their input and and so that's how the program got into being. And of course, like he said, we went on, maneuvered, and put it together and made it a reality. Reverend Butler, yeah, who was pastor, and of course, I was a member of Emmanuel, and he wanted the project to use black lawyers. Normally, especially during that time, we probably wouldn't have gotten the privilege of handling it. It would have been on Broad Street without question, you know. But anyway, you know, he's the one that got us into it, and we went up and Sumter and talked with Finney and Bishop, well, Reverend James at that time, Bishop James knows, you know, and got some input on some of how they did theirs, and of course, everything else he has said, you know, just sort of went that way.
Well, there's nothing unusual about developing a set of bylaws. Bylaws are determined by how you want to organize and govern your particular project. And every corporation has its own bylaws. And we therefore had to develop our bylaws consistent with how we wanted to manage and govern this project, along with the requirements of the federal government. Because having used their money or asking to use their money, they want to know how you're going to manage this project, because they are financing this project 100%, and it's up to you to manage it. And I think that's almost how your company came into being, because while we developed the skills or had the skills to get it started, to organize it, to get the loan and so forth, we didn't know too much about managing a project, and the people that we got to manage it in the beginning didn't work, and that's how we got to you. And then when we put it in the hands of professionals, which was your company, then that's when we started seeing some success in what we wanted to do. Not only did we take what Mr. Costa built under our contract, but this project as it is today is not what it was in 1968. And there's been a whole lot of improvements in this project, and it's a first-class project. You know, this isn't a project in the sense of how we think about a project. This is first class, and no one would believe that this is, you know, governmental operations in the sense that you usually find projects of this kind. For instance, I got, these are answers that we came up with. How many representatives from each church? These are questions which we had to answer to ourselves and pass on. Who nominates the representative from the church? Does the nominee have to be a member of the church, and are they required to be an officer? Does the board have to accept the nominee from the church? Term limits of each member, required times. But the government doesn't go into all of this. This is our management process, and this determines whether or not we are successful or not. But after we built this project, we took over 2 other projects, And the reason why we could get approved of our 2 other projects is because of the way we manage this project. And the way we manage this project is hands-off. We turned it over to your professionals. And we didn't do that in the beginning because we didn't have that experience. And I don't recall exactly how long we were in business before we acquired your management process. I don't recall how long that was. But we soon found out that we needed a different kind of management. And because we were not going to be successful with what we had, but we acquired them based upon our experience and what we knew. This is entirely new. These churches, you know, they manage $1 million project. They don't know nothing about that. And so we made some mistakes in the beginning, but we soon corrected those mistakes. And then after we corrected those mistakes, and then we could then acquire Darlington, and we could acquire the other 2 projects that we had, because we had good management reputation. And the reason we had good managed reputation is that we weren't managing it. And we turned it over to people who could manage it. This board makes its own decisions. The church itself has nothing to do with the operation of...
We just do give you the delegates.
Yeah, These properties are not owned by the churches. They are owned by the corporation, EME Apartments Incorporated, own the church. Now you have representatives on the board of EME Apartments, and your representatives on that board has a voice, but we have some questions right here in my notes. We do right now. We say, right, how many representatives from each church? Who nominates the representative from the church? Does the nominee have to be a member of the church, and are they required to be an officer? Does the board have to accept the nominee from the church? Term limits of each member, required times to meet. This is what we as a corporation determines and sends to the church. And we are satisfied with the answers we get from this. The churches itself doesn't manage the corporation. The corporation manages it. The church has a voice, but that's a vote, and that's it. But we've been successful in that churches have not interfered at all in the management of these properties.
When I was on the board, it gave me a satisfaction, especially of knowing that I was one of the attorneys involved in the creation of this entire matter. Of course, I came up under the tutorage and of my mentor here and sponsor here, or whatever you say, in the eyes of the law. A project such of this nature could come to fruition with black talents all the way. The builder, H.A. Costa, is a black business. Back in 1968, and the lawyers were black lawyers, and all of the ministers and churches and everything else was black. So it gives you a little picture of how black people were becoming more instrumental in big projects of this nature at that time, and the progress that has happened and gone on from that time to this makes anyone proud. It shows some progress that we have made and continue to make, and it speaks well for the EME Church, for the black church to be able to handle projects of this nature.
Let's see, I finished law school in I came to the bar in 1949, and I was appointed a municipal judge, I think in 1969. And I've had experience on 3 levels. I was first appointed municipal judge in 1969. Then I was appointed a family court judge. And then I was appointed a circuit judge. And I came on to this board and established this corporation, I think, in 1963. And I consider this to be one of the highlights of my profession. I have been involved with the EME Apartments Incorporated since its inception. This is my baby. And up until today, and will probably be involved with it until I die. It's a major success to me. These are $1 million projects, and the success is based upon the decisions that we made. And the decisions that we made was to acquire it, this tremendous business, and then to turn it over to somebody who knows what they're doing with it. And if we were trying to manage this as we did early on, we'd have been out of business a long time. But the success of this business is that we don't manage it. We get reports, and we got enough sense to see whether or not it's moving along. And we get reports, and the reports that we get tells us that we're doing well. And as I said to you, when we turn into this area here this morning, this is not the project that we started with years ago. This is not. There's been a constant improvement, constant. And these churches had nothing to do with that, except that they had the good judgment to turn it over to somebody who does. All they do is get a report. And that's the ownership structure of America. That's what America business is all about. That's what American government is all about. Is to give it to somebody who knows what to do with it, and to leave it alone. And the success, this is a trip right here. And not only did we establish this, every one of these other projects, 2 projects that we got, the reason we got it is because of Poe's business. We didn't build neither one of them. We bought it. And we took it under conditions that they couldn't handle it. Am I correct, Mr. Bush?
Yes, sir.
What makes this a success is what we did with it. We turned it over to somebody that knows what they're doing. And every time I drive into that driveway there and I look, I see something different that I had nothing to do with. I had no decision to make every time I turn into that driveway, except that I had something to do with building it. And then I left it alone and put it in the hands of somebody who knew how to do it. And that's what business is. Now I want you to know that Mr. Martin, when he came to my office, when he was, before you went to law school.
Yeah, well, I went back to law school.
Yeah. Yeah.
I taught school for a while when I first came to Charleston.
Yeah. His wife sent him to me. Where he was, telling me, you better get out. He's like my son. Yeah.
Yeah.